David Reinbacher scored in his AHL debut. We'll review the game that we both watched. We'll also talk about his play in Kloten this year. And where does David Reinbacher go from here? All coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we bring down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hadi Kalakash, joined by Sebastian High, and on today's show, we'll be dedicating the whole episode to David Reinbacher, the 5th overall pick of the 2023 NHL Draft, a Montreal Canadiens prospect, a 6'2", almost 200-pound right-handed defenseman, who spent the year in Kloten and had a difficult year, but has recently moved to Laval after Kloten finished their season, and has been playing fairly well. He played a very, very good game. Started off shaky, but ended up scoring his first AHL goal and his first AHL game, and it was a beauty. We'll get into his play with Laval that we both watched in our second segment. Then in our second segment, we'll be talking about his play in Kloten overall in the Swiss National League, the top level of pro hockey in Switzerland. We'll talk about, how Kloten's struggles this year, to say the least, made it a bit difficult for him to find his footing. And then in our final segment, we'll talk about where does David Reinbacher go from here? How was his projection affected, whether positively or negatively, by this year overall? And kind of where he ends up in the Habs lineup moving forward. But before getting into any of that, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. We're so close to 1,000. Help us get there. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please leave us a rate and review and make sure to make us your first listen of the day. So let's get things started here with David Reinbacher's AHL debut. I was there for the whole thing. You kind of hopped on later on in the game, but the first period was rough. I'm not going to lie. Defensively, there were a lot of concerns, a lot of lackings. But what did you like after that? What was so impressive to you in the second and third periods?
I mean, I think especially because the first period was rougher from your perspective, the fact that he was able to adapt as he did in the later periods, like as soon as I tuned in, he looked quite comfortable on the ice. He was keeping a really tight gap quite consistently, matching footwork of the opposing forwards in rushes very, very easily, as he's been doing all season long in Kloten. And the on-puck composure and confidence was already a bit higher than I'd seen in Kloten so far this season. And I'm sure that's
Yeah.
a decent amount because of there immediately being more trust in the system and the lineup, the line mates on the ice. And yeah, he looked quite comfortable against AHL competition, which also goes away to show how strong the National League has gotten in Switzerland in recent seasons, with a ton of ex-NHLers playing there. But no, I was impressed with his ability to keep that tight gap. In terms of his ability to defend the cycle, he was really boxing out players very well in front of his goaltender. Like, the goalie always had pretty clear sight lines when Reinbacher was on the ice, and
Yeah.
he was playing his style. Like as soon as I tuned in, it was very much like, oh yeah, this is David Reinbacher playing his style of game, which is exactly what you wanted from him in his AHL debut.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main standout for me with Reinbacher is the fact that, like I mentioned, the first period was rough. It was difficult. There were moments where he seemed very much panicked, very much set in the Kloten ways, which is basically stand still, wait for the play to happen, then figure things out. Whereas Laval's system, although it's still a pretty rudimentary dump and chase system, it's a very rudimentary defensive system. It still requires some form of fluidity. And once David Reinbacher started using his mobility, I mean, for me, his mobility is his major strength. Like, that's a main standout element of his game. He covers so much ice, and the fact that he was able to kind of activate that side of the game, that side of his game in a way that benefited his team was something that I really wanted to see, and I'm glad I saw moving forward. And we are talking before the episode. One of the things I look for when it comes to hockey sense is a player who consistently plays better in the third period. Now, with Kloten, it's hard to play better in the third period because the system demands so much energy for so little. But the one time that I've
And
gotten a chance, yeah, go ahead.
and they're usually down by like 3 goals by the time the third period
Yeah.
comes around.
Yeah, exactly. It's not easy. It's not good hockey. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, what's really fun in this game is that Reinbacher really improved his game, and I really enjoyed the confidence that he showed. I mean, for me, I think another issue that I had with Reinbacher in his draft year is I saw a very unconfident player. He was aggressive, sure, but you could always see a bit of hesitation with him, even in his defensive engagement, even in his rush gap control, like all that stuff. You could still see some hesitation. I saw very little hesitation from Reinbacher this year, so that was really really fun to watch from him in the AHL in this first game, and he scored his first goal, and it was an absolute beauty. He intercepted a puck in the neutral zone, skated up the ice, created a mini one-on-one scenario with a defenseman in front of him. He went with a quick backhand forehand, but in the same motion pulled off a toe drag around the defenseman, got in all alone on a 2-on-1 basically where the defenseman was fully giving him the shot, and he just rifled it low blocker and scored that beautiful beautiful goal. Um I mean, we've talked about this a lot with Reinbacher. I think that we both agreed that the main issue with Reinbacher was the handling skill. So to see him pull this off, uh, really fun, right?
Extremely fun, and I still do have some concerns in terms of the handling ability, especially like he can often be quite rigid when he's catching pucks on his backhand, for instance, and
Yeah.
he still has a fairly locked top hand, but I had not expected him to be able to pull off that type of a dangle, period, let alone against AHL competition. So
Yeah.
definitely like reason for optimism. And I think one of the things I would love to see from him moving forward with Laval is that continuation in testing out his toolkit and pushing his limits and being open to making mistakes. In Kloten, when he would make a mistake, more often than not, the puck would land in the back of his net. It was always a very, very high risk that he'd have to take if he was going to try to do anything along those lines. But with Laval, there is more trust immediately in the system, in the defensive structure, in his defensive partner. And yeah, I'd love to see him be able to test out those abilities a bit more consistently, because if the handling can get to a level of like NHL average, then I'm seeing like number two defenseman upside as being far more tangible than otherwise.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a great part of that is the players they have on the right side now. So we have, Laval has David Reinbacher, obviously, Logan Mailloux, and Justin Barron. When you have those three
Yeah.
guys on the right side, you kind of need to be able to give them, kind of give them the reins to just go and do their thing, because those are three players that love to activate offensively, that love to create, and want to take risks. So if you limit that ability, you're taking away a lot of what they do right. So for me, Reinbacher is the safer of the three, the more defensively responsible of the three, and the least likely to do something that could be categorized as not smart. But overall, I think that in those three defensemen, you're getting you have three guys who you need to be able to kind of give the offensive reins to just go and do their thing, because otherwise you're, like I said, you're taking a lot away from their game if you're not letting them do that. So I think Reinbacher's in a great seat right now, and the fact that he's competing with those two guys and keeping up in his first AHL game is really interesting. It's not something that I expected from him this early. Um, but yeah, overall, I mean, the game ended 3-2 in overtime, right? And Logan Mailloux got that goal in overtime to win the game. And for me, that was a game that I think teaches Reinbacher a lot in terms of a first experience. Just being like, oh, I can do this. This is fine. This is okay. You know, jumping up aggressively on a turnover, on a neutral zone pass, right? Like that alone was something that we saw sometimes in Kloten, but not nearly as consistently. Then, activating up to the offensive blue line, then trying the toe drag, then taking the shot off a 2-on-1. Like these are all little things that Reinbacher kind of immediately learned that he's allowed and able to do, which I think is so important moving forward, right?
For sure. It was a really strong AHL debut. And I mean, the defensive strengths that he showed later on in the game, I think was to be expected. Like those are the things that Reinbacher does very well, very consistently, whether it be that tight gap control, that aggression in the defensive zone, being able to use his mobility, physicality, sense of timing and anticipation together in unison to be a really like a shutdown force on the defensive side
Yeah.
of the puck. that was to be expected. Like, those are the big strengths that got him drafted 5th overall. But the on puck ability and that being able to shine already more than it had all season long in Kloten, that's something to be really excited about. And I'm very curious to see how he's able to develop that now in the coming weeks and months with the Laval Rocket.
Fully agree. But that wraps things up for our first segment. We'll talk about David Reinbacher's time in Kloten, what went wrong, what went right, and how that affected his development in our second segment, right after these messages from our sponsors at Game Time. If you are looking to buy cheap tickets last minute to any event, Game Time has you covered. Game Time is a great source for last minute tickets. They have great deals up until the last minute before the event goes up, and sometimes an hour after it starts. You can still get tickets over at Game Time. They're obsessed with saving you money. They have a bunch of deals to help you kind of get the best price for your tickets. My favorite deal is zone deals, where you pick the section and Game Time picks the seat. That gives you about an average of 18% of savings, and the Game Time guarantee make sure that you always get the best prices for your tickets. If you find a ticket in the same section and row for less than what Game Time has to offer, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. And this is not just for games. This is also for theater, comedy, basically anything that requires tickets. Game Time is the best place to get that set up. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, super easy. You just create an account and use a promo code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. So download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Alrighty, so moving on to our second segment, we'll be talking about David Reinbacher's time in Kloten in the Swiss National League. Now, this is a pro league, and it's a pro league that's increased in quality since everything that happened in Russia. A lot of the players that would be going to the KHL are instead going to the Swiss National League. We've got a bunch of former NHLers, names you might recognize like Frederick Gauthier. There are a lot of names that couldn't make an NHL roster that go for the Swiss National League because there's a lot of money there. So yeah, I think this year for Kloten was extremely difficult, and I think everyone who's watched them at any point this season can agree. They went through two coaching changes this
Yes.
season, including going back to their first coach that they had at the start of the season, which is just a very strange idea. But yeah, this is something, Thibaut Châtel, who's a great reporter out of Switzerland, a great hockey analyst, put out an article on David Reinbacher's time in Kloten, what went wrong with Kloten, and all that good stuff. If you want to go and check it out, it's great, great work. But to sum it up, Colton was playing a system that didn't benefit his team, its players. It didn't work to his players' strengths. It was very static, very, both defensemen on each pair would just kind of sit in the defensive zone or right at the defensive blue line, and just kind of wait for play to develop. Right. I think that was kind of the main prominent issue that at least affected Reinbacher. There's a bunch of other stuff around that we can into, but I think that for me was the crux of the issue regarding how that harmed Reinbacher's development this year. Right.
Yeah, it was an extremely passive system. Like, there was rarely much cohesion between line mates in terms of ideas and plans. Like, it was very much a dump and chase system, but it lacked pace. And as soon as like often pucks would not be recovered on the dump and chase, but when they were, there was often a bit of panic of what to do next, and a real lack of ideas, creativity, pace, and possession, which
Yeah.
really limits what that a team could really do on the ice. And with David Reinbacher, he had to settle into a very conservative defensive role because he was the most mobile and most physical and best shutdown defenseman on that team, and was just constantly trying to mitigate problems and try to put out fires that were just consistently being started. And that meant that he was very much in a defensive role first and foremost, and any desire to take risks on the puck and trying things, trying to get implicated offensively, the risk was always so high of when he would jump up into the play and get caught and wouldn't be able to get back. More often than not, the puck would land in the back of his net. So he had to really mitigate what he was trying to do on the puck, and it resulted in a play that was very much in some ways similar to how he might play in the NHL as a rookie in terms of playing it very safe and conservatively. And that did allow him to refine a lot of his defensive tools. For instance, I thought that he was really quite capable in developing his ability to use his mobility to close gaps and cover a ton of ice because he had to. And I thought that his defensive game did certainly mature over the course of the season, but the offensive game just stagnated because he didn't really have any ability to any opportunity to practice it, and especially in
Yeah.
terms of like his offensive skills, like one of the things he's best at is activating off puck, getting up into like the high slot when the pucks are in the corner, staying in the blind spots of opposing defensemen, making sure that he's in an open passing lane, and being a pretty solid shooting threat from that slot. But that just didn't happen consistently at all this season because, again, possession was often just immediately lost on the dump in, and he was just forced to like stay glued to the blue line. So
Yeah.
it was a difficult season, certainly for Kloten.
Y- Yeah, for sure. I think the main other thing that we kind of talked about before the episode as well is how many 50-50 battles Cologne created, or kind of forced even at times with multiple dump ins to shift. Situations where their forwards are working really hard to win pucks back, but there isn't really any structured possession play that's at least consistent enough, and that's an issue with Reinbacher. That's an issue for Reinbacher rather because in 50-50 battles, you're on your heels. You're trying to figure out what happens next. When your forward is in a battle with a defenseman in the corner and you're the defenseman for your team trying to close in on the offensive zone blue line, you need to keep a bit of a hesitation because you never know when the puck is going to pop out to an opponent. You're going to have to start skating backwards. That hesitation, that lack of knowledge of what's happening next, I think really harmed Reinbacher because Reinbacher could have really benefited from structured offensive play in order to activate even more, move off the puck even more, push up to the hash marks, make plays from there, play give and goes. And we saw more give and goes from him this year. And the occasions where Kloten kept the puck or cycled it up after a battle. But the fact that he on almost every zone entry, he had to kind of be on his heels and figure out what happens next, I think wasn't beneficial to his game. But I did like the progress in his passing ability. That's one big thing that I really enjoyed watching from Reinbacher this year. The mobility's taken, I think, even a step further, where he's using his crossovers even better when moving laterally. He's closing gaps with more aggression, but also the right timing with more kind of understanding of what's going on. So there have been some definite steps up, but I think the overall feeling I got from this year with Reinbacher was hesitation. And with a player with this kind of style, you don't want to see that. And I'm hoping that kind of changes moving forward. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, do you see any other issues with what Kloten brought night in, night out that could have harmed Reinbacher's game? Anything that, you see as something that could be an issue moving forward? Or is this, are we talking about some things that were just a result of his environment and moving forward we'll probably not see as an issue, right?
Yeah, like I wouldn't be overly concerned in terms of the long-term impact of having played in Kloten this year. Like disastrous as the environment was, I do think that Reinbacher's style and his strengths
Yeah,
meant that that risk was mitigated because he was still able to work on the things that he's best at in terms of the defensive zone ability, the breakout passing. Like he was really able to practice his stretch passing this season just because Kloten needed to try to create something, and that's a tool that is very strong with Reinbacher, and especially in terms of the ability to go on a puck retrieval and just immediately scan and bomb a puck up ice. That's something he was
mhm,
able to practice a ton this season because there were a lot of retrievals for him, and he had a lot of practice in terms of those first couple touches upon retrieving a puck, whether he was pressured or not.
yeah,
And again, I do think that his ability to manage chaos in the defensive zone got a lot of reps and a lot of practice this season, which
for
is not a
sure.
bad thing. So there were some positives of being in that environment in some ways, and like managing chaos is something that is very important to get reps on before making the jump to the NHL. But yeah, like I think that like the main thing with him was there was a real limitation in practicing the on puck game and specifically the handling, which in his draft year was a big question mark or a big area of relative weakness in his toolkit. And I still think is the case. Beautiful as that one dangle was for his first AHL goal, and I'm really hoping that his time in Laval gives him a lot more reps on the puck, a lot more puck touches, and a lot more time with possession and with control of the play on his stick, being able to determine where he wants play to go and taking on a little bit more of like a general role from the blue line.
Yeah, I think that'll be better moving forward. But that wraps us up for our second segment. We'll get into our third, where we talk about where does Reinbacher go from here? What is the next step in his development? How his projection has changed, and all that good stuff. We'll get into that right after these messages from our sponsors here at Sleeper.
We're past the halfway point of the NHL season now with the trade deadline in the rear view, but there's still time to get in on the action with Sleeper. Sleeper is our number one choice here at the Locked On NHL Podcast Network for all of your daily fantasy hockey needs. That's because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. And all you need to do to win that is to correctly predict the outcome of 8 specific player stats. And you can have some fun, get creative with that, whether you want to bet on the stars of the league to put up some big points, whether it be Nikita Kucherov, who's been scoring about 3 points a game in the last couple games, or I don't know, Connor McDavid, who isn't all that bad at hockey either. Or maybe you can stay a bit more in line with the topic of this podcast and take some swings on the NHL's young guns, like Connor Bedard, who is still producing at a very high level on a not so good team, and even Leo Carlson, though he just went down to injury after a knee-on-knee contact. So the choice is yours with Sleeper. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability.
Alrighty, so talking about our final segment here, we'll be discussing David Reinbacher's progression from here. Where does he go from here now that he's with the Laval Rocket? How soon we can expect him in the NHL? Production wise, how things have changed for him? Projection wise, all that good stuff. Let's start with what the next step is for him development wise. What do you see as kind of the most important step forward in his development starting now in order to make him a bona fide, number 2, number 3 defenseman like he could be?
More puck touches. I think the AHL is a great place for him to be playing right now. It's a level where he's being challenged, certainly, but has on the one hand is able to adapt to the North American ice surface, which is a bit easier for him than other prospects, perhaps because Kloten's been practicing on an NA ice surface, and he's been with Kloten for like 4 or 5 years in that system, so he's already familiar with the ice size itself, but perhaps
Yeah.
not in highly competitive games. But I think like being able to increase his puck touches, maybe being given the reins to a second power play, though Mayu and Justin Barron certainly are also power play pieces there in Laval. But I think that just giving him those reps, allowing him to translate to North America, giving him time, but also a ton of time on ice and puck touches, like that would be my big focus. I'm not overly worried about the defensive impact. Like with the more time on ice he'll get, the better he's going to get on that front as well. And I think big
Yeah.
PK minutes, second power play minutes, first or second pairing, even strength minutes. And maybe by the time the fall comes around, he could already contend for an NHL spot. But I would also be very open to giving him a full season and just give him the reins to the Laval blue line next year and give him a full season to just get acclimated.
Yeah, I think that's the important part for me is, you want him to be able to grow into that role fairly well. And I don't think he can do that as smoothly and as well if he's thrown to the wolves on a bottom pair or second pair in Montreal from the jump. I think it'd be a really good idea to give him at least, 6, 9 months in the AHL before calling him up, including his time right now. Like there's still about, a handful of games to the Laval goodness, there's still a couple games left to the Laval Rocket season. Just writing that out, perhaps if they make the playoffs, being able to get into that conversation as well. that gives them a good month of hockey at the AHL level. Then if you give him another 5-6 months next year, see how he plays, and if he's really the best defenseman in the Laval Rocket, give him a call up, see how he works out. But I don't think there should be much of a rush to get him in the NHL because he still has some things to learn at the AHL level. Um, in terms of the things I want him to learn, you mentioned activating off the puck as being something he does consistently. I don't see it as something consistent. I see it as something that he's good at when he does it. And playing more give and
I meant
goes,
that.
getting
Yes.
yeah, making playing more give and goes, being able to make plays off the blue line where he's finding a teammate that pops out to the high slot, then skating up the boards, getting the puck back, doing the same, perhaps even moving around the net, something like that, rather than just kind of handling the puck around the ice like he did in his draft year. I think that's a big first step that I've seen in his progression that I'd like to see continuing. In terms of the production, I still see David Reinbacher as kind of a 30 to 40 point number two, number three defenseman who's mainly tasked with defensive responsibilities. But if he can get more comfortable on the puck, learn to play, that give and go hockey more frequently, get involved with puck touches below the hash marks more often, maybe it goes to 40 or 50. What do you think?
Yeah, I think like 40 points is like my like conceivable upside. Obviously, if he plays long term with a player like Lane Hudson, I think there's like a bit more production that just comes very naturally from playing in that type of
Yeah.
position. But yeah, like I think like the biggest value with Reinbacher is always going to be the defensive impact, but
Mhm.
it'd be great if the offensive impact can take some strides as well. And I think like number two is probably the higher end of the upside. Like I don't really see number one potential with David Reinbacher, but if he's a number two at the end of the day, that's an excellent piece to add to your cupboard. And I also love the fit in terms of how he fits in with other players in Montreal's system. Like the idea of him, like obviously with Lane Hudson at even strength, I like a lot. Even being like maybe a shutdown pairing with a guy like Caden Gooley could be a ton of fun, especially because David Reinbacher's breakout passing ability would take a decent load off of Caden Gooley's back, which he's been taking on a lot when he's not been playing with Mike Matheson at the NHL level and just isn't a
Yeah.
strength just yet. And
Mhm.
even like this season, like if Laval makes the playoffs, I would adore to see a Jaden Struble and David Reinbacher pairing. I think that'd be a ton of fun, and both players would be able to learn a lot from each other in that type of position. So I'm very curious to see how David Reinbacher develops here in Laval, but I'm fully with you. I don't think there's any rush. He's 19 years old. He's a very young player and mature of a style as he does play. If you rush him, he might get pigeonholed into that simple, mature style of play, and giving him time in Laval to marinate on that on puck ability, I think, is where a lot more value could come with time. So I think the patient approach with Reinbacher would be a
Yeah.
wise one. Even though he could already play pretty solid bottom pairing minutes in the NHL, I wouldn't be overly concerned throwing him to the Wolves in terms of the impact he'd have on the ice. It's more just the impact it would have on his development that gives me a bit more pause with that.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that the main issue is you don't want him to stagnate development wise. You want him to progress in ways that are meaningful. And he can't do that from a bottom pair in the NHL. He needs puck touches. And bottom pairing defensemen don't get those as frequently. So I'd like to see him reach the 23, 24 minute mark in the AHL before, comfortably reach that 23, 24 minute mark in the AHL before he sees any NHL ice time. But yeah, overall, I think his development hasn't been too much impacted by his awful year in Kloten. I think that, you know, despite the fact that the structure really limited what he was able to do, I think he expanded on some very particular things really well. And now that he's in the AHL, he has a great opportunity to pick up where he left off and kind of improve the things that he couldn't in Kloten. And we've seen some of that with Laval already in his first AHL game. So I'm excited moving forward for Reinbacher, and we'll see how that develops. So that wraps things up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your news and updates about what's going on around sports. Make sure to tune in for our next show as we continue our prospects coverage for the month of March. This has been Hattie Kalakash with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.